autumn events. We've got, I think, 10 or 12 lined up so far. We're here tonight, however, with Nancy Thorndike Greenspan, who is the previous author of The End of the Certain World, a biography of Max Born, another great quantum physicist. And she's also the co-author of 4 books with her late husband, the child psychiatrist Stanley Greenspan. She lives in Bethesda, Maryland. And she's now the new author of yet another biography of a scientist called Atomic Spy. And it's a biography, of course, of Klaus Fuchs. And this is, of course, very timely since this is August 6th, Hiroshima Day. And Klaus Fuchs, of course, worked on the atomic bomb at Los Alamos with Robert Oppenheimer and others. And later it was revealed he had been spying for the Soviet Union. I first met Nancy Greenspan, Nancy, it must have been 20 years ago.
I think it was.
When we were both attending a regular writers' luncheon in Washington, D.C., when I was still living there. And Nancy was then working on her Max Born biography. And, she's become now a preeminent biographer of scientists. And this is her second book of a major scientist and spy. And it's a terrific book. It's just a fabulous read. It's a spy thriller, but all true. Biography, I have to say, is really a difficult art. But it's also particularly difficult to write a biography of a scientist. For all the obvious reasons. You have to convey to the reader the science or some sense of what your figure was doing as a scientist. And that's yet another hurdle. So, Nancy, why is it so hard to write about scientists? Tell us a little bit how you started down this particular path. And you might mention your relationship with Gustav Born, I believe, who helped both on Max and your biography of Max Born and this book.
Well, I'm getting feedback. Is anybody else? Is an echo. Are you here? I don't.
Talk over it.
Are you okay?
I can hear you.
Okay. I did not appreciate. Do you hear this?
I hear some background noise, yes, but I can hear you well.
Oh well, I'm hearing myself.
Do you have earbuds to put in?
Do I?
Yes.
I have.
Try that. Yes, try that.
Sorry. Wait a minute. Is that better?
No.
No. Well, have I got too many mics on?
Maybe so, yeah. Try turning off mics.
I'm not sure how to do that. I apologize. I think if...
Look at the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and maybe there's something to click on with regard to audio or video help.
My video is lagging. Click to enable compatibility mode.
This could be an internet problem, Nancy. I think you should just push on. Try to see if it clears up.
Okay.
Yeah. So
all right.
we're talking about Gustav Born.
We are talking about scientists and my involvement with them. If I had realized how difficult it was to write about them, I may never have done so. I kind of just jumped in, being naive. I have actually never had a physics class, and trying to understand quantum physics with no background was a reach. I do have a math background in economics, and the math is the same. It's just got different variables for the X's and Y's. So I understood matrices, which were very important in quantum physics that Bourne did. So it gave me a few panic attacks, but I did push through it. I also talked to lots of people. With Fuchs, it was much better. With Bourne, it was the reason to write about him. His science was the important part of his life. With Fuchs, there were many dimensions. So science was just a piece. And I was able to do it in an encapsulated way. As I figured, people don't really want a detailed design of how you make an atomic bomb. I mean, you ran into the same thing when you were writing about Oppenheimer. And we were both struggling at the very same time with our biographies when we were writing. And it is very difficult. So with Bourne, it was a real struggle because he did every kind, not only quantum, but he just did everything. Fuchs was better.
Well, I'm sorry we're having these technical problems. We were fine 15 minutes ago before we went live, but it's weird. Yeah, well, no, you're right. I had the same issues when I was dealing with Oppenheimer. It was very hard to explain. I took physics for poets in college. So it was very hard for me to explain in plain English what Oppenheimer was doing in quantum physics. And but you push ahead, and you're as knowledgeable as your reader, and you try to do your best to explain it. So when you finished Bourne, how soon after finishing Bourne did you land on Fuchs?
Actually, quickly. But then I didn't do anything because of my family issues. So I did a little bit of research, and then I had to take a break. So I didn't get back to it until really about 5 or 6 years ago.
So how long did this whole project take?
It depends upon when I started. I think I would start myself in about 2015 of really organizing what I was finding. And I was a hunter-gatherer for a while. I would go off for 2 weeks, get material, come home, set it aside, and then do other things that I needed to do.
But why Klaus Fuchs? If you were interested in atomic spies, why not Ted Hall or the Rosenbergs? Or how did you land on Klaus?
Well, Klaus was a student, a postdoctoral fellow with Max Born.
Nancy, do you have any other devices turned on?
Do I have other devices turned on?
Do you have a phone turned on, another computer?
No. You know what? Let me move my iPad, which I don't have anything linked.
Because it sounds like you're hearing it twice.
Yeah, everything coming back at me.
Oh dear. Well, this is a new universe, and we're trying to figure out the technical aspect of it.
Yeah, now, what happened when we went live?
Nancy, why don't you sign off for a second, and Kai, and then sign back on? See if that helps.
So I should leave.
Yeah, leave.
Should I leave too?
No, stay on, Kai, and we'll
Okay. So I'm
Just log off and log back on.
okay. I will completely do this. Leave.
Apologies, everyone. This is really a great book, a wonderful narrative piece of history and biography. And she really does tell it as a spy story. There we go.
How's that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
better. Much better.
Oh, it says tap to unmute sound. So there's something that's been muted by my going off. But since we
Good.
didn't need two of these, this is good. Thank you. Oh, this is so much better. Nice to see you, Kai. Hi.
Hey.
So let's go at it.
So I was asking you why Klaus Fuchs instead of, for instance, Ted Hall. And you were
Yes.
saying that he was a student of Max Born's. Huh?
Yes. And I actually got interested in him when I was doing working on Born, because I had a lot of family papers from the Borns. I had huge numbers of letters and diaries, and in those during the late 30s when Fuchs was there, he was always showing up in some little piece of paper that I had from the Borns, and he was showing up as a very nice person. He took their children out to the movies. He played cards with them, scat, which the Germans do. He was in their little ensemble, music ensemble that Born had at his house. And people liked him. He was very quiet and very shy, but he was a nice person. And all of a sudden he was a spy, and they were dumbfounded. And I came into this information as I did it, because I didn't know much about him when I was, first working on it. So at that point, as I was writing about Born, I thought I should find out more about Fuchs, because he's an interesting person to put in the book. I went to the archives in London, and there were 3 little skimpy files. And at the very last one I looked at had a letter, a memo in it from somebody in the administration saying, what am I supposed to do with all these Fuchs files from his trial and everything? And the person who received it said, throw them away. So when I saw this, I thought, oh, no.
Dear.
Yes, there's not anything. So for the Born book, it was what it was. I had a little bit of information, and I had a lot from the Borns and newspapers and things, and that's what I used. So when I finished, about a year after I finished, a friend of mine in Germany said, why don't you think about writing about Fuchs? Because this person was interested in him too. And I thought, well, that's interesting. But I said, I'm not sure there's enough information to write about him. And about a year, and so when I looked, it was the early 2000s, and my book came out in 2005. So I hadn't gone back, because it was what it was. I went back to the archives in London, and I looked, and in between time, MI5 had declassified hundreds and hundreds of files, not only on Fuchs, but all of the people from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, many of these files. There were pages missing that they wouldn't let you see, but basically there were thousands of pages there. So I thought, well, this is a good start. So yes, I can do this. And he was an inherently interesting person, and he became more so as I met his family, got family papers, heard other stories, read all the other. I was able to find a huge number of archives that nobody else had ever found. And I like being a detective. So that set me on a path. In fact, I found so much I didn't know what to do with it all. It was just, this is what happens. You get so much. At some point, if you don't stop, you'll never finish.
Right,
So
right.
This is it.
Well, biographers are detectives. That's what we do.
Yeah.
We do a lot of detective work. But I was astonished at the end of your book, you list over 25 or almost 30 archives that you visited, and they're all over the world. So which was your favorite one? Which was the most productive in this treasure hunt?
The most productive was at the University of Kiel. And I was told by a friend in Germany not to even bother to go there. There was one file there and it was on the father, Emil Fuchs. So just don't bother. And I thought, oh, I can't do that. I need to go. I just need to have somebody else tell me that. And being an American sitting here, I went to the archivist. And many people don't do that. If it's your country and you know how things work, you go to the archives yourself and you look. So I wrote to this archivist, who was this lovely lady. And I had I did it in German. I have enough German to be able to do that. It's not great, but it's good enough. And she wrote me back and she said, I think you might find gold here. And she sent me the numbers for some files they had that were labeled miscellaneous disciplinary matters. Nothing to do with Klaus Fuchs.
Wow.
So she was right. She had obviously peeked. She knew what was in them. And I went to this archive in this very sweet little town. It's not in Kiel. It's up above Kiel in Schleswig, like the cow. You know, the Holstein Schleswig is the area. And it was all about the Fuchs. It was about Klaus and his brother and all of the Nazis that they fought and all of the problems that occurred. And then once I got the idea of how to find things, I could go through the files myself and found lectures they were giving, and pulling a group together, all kinds of stuff. I just found hundreds and hundreds of pages.
So that's a good point. Let's have you talk a little bit about Klaus himself as a young man and how he became politicized, how he became an anti-fascist, and tell us that story, because that obviously gets into the motivation for what comes next.
It does. It was the key part of his life, and it was one of the, to me, most fascinating, because nobody else. It was well. Let me just say, okay. So he started off in a family of 4 children. He was number 3. He was born right before World War I in 1911, and he had a very politically active father. The father was extremely liberal. He was a minister, and he was in the very conservative Lutheran church. The two did not match. And his mission in life was to support the working class. He was a socialist. He joined the Social Democratic Party, the Socialist Party in Germany. He wasn't a communist. There were very strong distinctions between those two things. And all of his children became socialists. Whereas Klaus was extremely reserved. His father was very outspoken, but they both had the same steely, unbending determination inside. And they were both the same in that way. They just espoused it in different ways. But Klaus, when he was a teenager, he was the scholar in the family. He was famous in the area for his mathematical gifts and talents. And when he was a senior in high school, in the gymnasium, he won the regional prize from the Weimar Republic of the best student. It was only given out once in a while because it was a celebration. It was of the best student in the whole area. And that he didn't talk about politics at all. He left that out. His brother and 2 sisters and his father did all the talking that was needed. And they did it all the time. They were all activists. So he goes off in 1930 to the University of Leipzig to study mathematics, because that's what he wanted to do. And his brother was there studying law, and he went to live with his brother. And the first thing his brother had him do was join the Socialist Party, the students there. And already in 1930, there were fights in the streets. The Nazis got their grips in the German universities really early. And most of the students were from well-to-do families. They weren't rich, but they were government official kids. They weren't the working class. They weren't the poor. I mean, those people couldn't go. So there weren't many socialists and there weren't many communists. There were a lot of Nazis, and they were having fights in the streets. And Klaus said at one point, I learned more in the streets than I did in the classroom at that point. He was only there for 1 year, and then he and his brother both moved to the University of Kiel. And they started their own socialist student group with both communists and socialists there. They felt there should be a merging of the two. That was the only way they could have a big enough concentration to really fight the Nazi students. And the Nazi students in Kiel were much more entrenched than they had been in Leipzig. They had already taken over the student government and all of that. And so they started, the way the students fought at that time initially was by making incendiary speeches and handing out pamphlets that called each other's names and did things like that, and have newspapers that people wrote. So that was the level of the discourse, but it could cause tumult. It could cause a few fisticuffs and things like that. And the administration actually was not a Nazi administration at all at that point, and they gave the Fuchs brothers a lot of leeway to a large degree. But in 1932, the turning point for Fuchs came, which gives the rest, sets up the platform for the rest of his life. 1932 was a presidential election. Hindenburg was running for a second term. The socialists decided they were going to support Hindenburg because they didn't want to split the vote. There was another candidate running for president, and they wanted to make sure that candidate didn't get in. The candidate was Adolf Hitler. So when the Fuchses, Klaus and his brother Gerhard, learned this, they were dismayed because Hindenburg, being very conservative, they'd been fighting all the policies that his government was bringing in, and they just couldn't support him. So they started supporting the communist candidate, and immediately the Social Democrats, the Socialist Party, kicked them out. The communists said, "Oh, come be with us." Klaus hesitated because of other things, and eventually he and Gerhard both joined, and they never looked back. That was it. And at first, it wasn't, they didn't join because they were communists. They were for the working class. They joined because they wanted to fight the Nazis, and they saw it that the socialists were not fighting the Nazis. And that's fairly true. The socialists fought the communists, and the communists fought the socialists. They hated each other.
So he was traumatized eventually by this whole experience, no?
Yes. They tried to kill the Nazi students, their council voted secretly to kill him. And that was in 1933. There was a riot, and the SA beat him up, and the students around the university in the riot were yelling, "Throw him in the fjord." Now the fjord was a piece of the Baltic Sea, and this was in February. It was, you couldn't be in there but for a few minutes before it would kill you, and they threw him in. All he ever said about it was he swam out. That's the only information one has, but obviously he survived, and they did do it. So it was very traumatic. And then he ended up in Berlin a few weeks later, and the Gestapo was after him, and there were resistors in the underground, and they were trying to get people to mobilize against the Nazis. They were risking their life every single minute, and the Gestapo was, ruthless and tortured them all. And it was terrible, and they all did it. So it was a terrible life for those 3 years, and it did have an effect on him.
Yeah. So this is obviously part of his motivation for what he does later.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So at one point in your narrative, you quote Dick Wright, the head of the British MI5. This is after the case breaks and they have caught Fuchs. Anyway, Dick White, you say, thought Fuchs's motives were, quote, relatively speaking, pure, meaning he didn't do his spying for money. It was all ideology. And
yes,
he was angry as a physicist that when he saw that the British and the Americans, by this time he had become a British citizen after fleeing Germany. So he was angry with the British and then the Americans for withholding science and scientific information from an ally, the Soviets. So he just wanted to balance the table, right?
Yes, that is true. Also, Dick White was also head of MI6, MI5 and MI6, I think. So he was really involved, and he was there when they were prosecuting Fuchs. He was right in MI5 at that time. People liked Fuchs. They saw it as, they didn't think what he did was right. But they liked him as a person because there was enough. Some people didn't like him because he was too reserved. It made them feel creepy. There were women who said, he never said anything. But others liked him very much. And he was very, very generous to his friends with his time and help. His motives were completely ideological. He was very angry. As this war started in 1939, he was reading the newspapers. See, in his mind, what it looked like was, and there was some truth to this, especially in the upper classes of the British society, would be nice if the Germans and the Russians just fought each other and did each other in, and if the Germans won, it was okay with them. There was a lot of sentiment along those lines, and there was very little in the newspapers about, we got to help our allies, the Russians. And well, at that point they weren't, because this was after, there'd been that Ribbentrop-Molotov pact for a year. But after they received, they got attacked, the Russians got attacked, that the Brits did nothing to help them. And so that he just felt that they really hated the communists and they were going to do whatever they could to get rid of them. And by that time he was a communist. When he first joined, he was not, but by then he had decided, he had gone full into it ideologically.
He became a real true believer.
True believer. Yes.
Loyal to the party and defended it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Completely. And he was always talking about it to friends at the time when he was open about being a communist, when he was first there as a young student in Bristol and Edinburgh. One of the born daughters, Irena, told me, she said, you go to the movies with him, and the whole way back and forth, he'd be telling you about communism, So he didn't keep it a secret at that point. He did later, but he didn't then.
So moving along in your story, Klaus begins working, he's a very good scientist, and he begins working for the British in Britain on the early bomb project. And then he gets transferred in 1944 to Los Alamos.
Yes.
And there he meets Oppenheimer and all these other noted scientists. And he's, at this point, he has been passing things on to the Soviets for, when did the spying start? 42?
41, August of 1941 is when he started.
And he's very successful at it, very calm. No one suspects him.
Right.
He slips right under the radar. As you say, people either like him because he's friendly and he's not a big ego.
No.
He's in this way a perfect spy in some ways.
Exactly.
But then what really struck me about your narrative is when he moves back to Britain after the war is over, he's working at a scientific institute there, and you found these surveillance transcripts. He came under suspicion, and they started following him and tapping his phones and his house, and and you have the transcripts of these conversations. It's just,
yes.
It's really, wow, what a rich resource.
Hundreds of pages, and all of his friends, they tapped his friends' phones too. So it was coming and going. You got both sides twice.
Yeah, no, this is a very unusual, rich source for a biographer to actually have telephone transcripts. A diary is good, but a telephone transcript is, in the moment. It's
yes.
just, so were these transcripts declassified fairly recently in the last 10 years, or?
Well, I think they mostly came out around 2005, 2000. So from 2003 to 2008, Gradually, not only were they telephoned, they had them they had bugs in his house, in his office. So people walking into his office and asking him a question, or people sitting around the table, or him being on the telephone to somebody that they, didn't have, they would get all of that. So they had almost every inch of his life covered for 3 to 4 months but he wasn't spying. So there wasn't any.
There was nothing. So that's the other mystery, of course. They have good evidence from Venona. You can explain what Venona is, but they really didn't. They hadn't caught him in the act. He wasn't. Right. So then there's this little delicate dance between his interrogators and Fuchs, and this is just a marvelous story. But it's sort of I'm struck by how naive he is. He's willing to sort of say, well, yes, I did do that, but it wasn't really important. And he didn't consider it spying, apparently.
He didn't consider it spying. He considered it something he could do because they were allies and we had promised to cooperate with them. And he was just really kind of helping out the UK and the US with the information they were supposed to give and didn't.
So how did he actually get caught?
Well, there was all this information about him, and he wasn't spying, so they couldn't use it. Venona was done here in, just a few miles from where I'm sitting in Arlington, Virginia. There was a big decoding center, and there was the US and the UK both had their people there, and they had Russian messages from the early 40s. And for various reasons, they had struggled for years to try to decode them, and they finally found the code, and they deciphered bunches and bunches of them. And when they did, they saw that there was a spy involved in the Manhattan Project. They didn't, it was called REST, but they didn't know who REST was, but they knew there was somebody involved. And there were little hints about he had a sister and he did this, he might have gone here or there, so they could kind of look at time frames. And that's how they knew there was somebody. Within 2 weeks, they had figured out it was probably Klaus. They weren't 100% sure, but everything, he fit everything. So, but what's interesting to me, the interesting piece in this is that he knew he was going to be uncovered. He knew it. They didn't know this. They didn't find this out until August of 1949, that there were these messages and that this information was in it. In April of 1949, he stopped spying. And I go through the evidence of what was going on, which is a little complicated, but it basically, the only thing he ever said about it was he wrote a note to his father when he was in prison, and his father had come to visit him in the summer of 1949. And at that time, there was an interest in having a nephew come and live with Klaus, and Klaus would take care of him. And he said to his father when he was from prison, the next year, he wrote and saying, now you understand why I couldn't take care of this little boy. Right. And implying that this all was going on, but it didn't. In July, when his father and nephew were there, MI5 and the FBI didn't know that he was a spy. They didn't even know there was a spy at that point. He knew that they were getting close to figuring it all out. How, I do not know. But anyway, that didn't work. So they then decided, after much discussion, because they didn't know what he would do if they interviewed him, they decided MI5 interviewed him, and they interviewed him several times, maybe 4 times. And
we tell this great story about Jim Scarden, the MI5 officer, who was a great interrogator, just very gentle and calm, hours and hours of discussions. And then he finally, at one point, Klaus sort of blurts out and says, yes, I did that.
And at the time he did that, he had decided himself to confess. Another friend had convinced him that he had to confess to make sure his friends didn't fall under suspicion. And that is why he confessed. There were other pieces to that, but that was the main one. And he felt extremely guilty that he had done this and not realized it, that he had never been aware of these problems that could cause his friends, because if it wasn't Klaus, and it had to be someone else. Just, there had to be someone else that was like that, and it would be one of his friends who was,
So he confesses in what, February of 1950?
Just the end of January. Yeah.
January.
Yes.
And so this is 1950. So the Korean War hasn't yet broken out.
No, it hasn't.
But there is, the whiff of McCarthyism, and it's, the Cold War is raging, and the Soviets have finally, 4 years after Hiroshima, they've tested their own atomic bomb, and this ratchets up the Cold War to a new frightening stage. So he's uncovered, he's unmasked just at a very delicate time.
Yes.
And so what happened? The surprising thing to me is that, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg get caught a few years later, and they get executed. But Klaus Fuchs gets a 14-year sentence.
Yes. That's what it was.
So why did this happen in British justice?
They tried him for espionage, not treason. If it had been treason, he would have been hung. And he assumed he would be hung. That's what he thought was going to happen to him. Wow. He confessed. He thought maybe that could happen to him. But they tried him for espionage, as far as I can tell, because at the time he was spying for a friendly nation. They were allies, the Russians were. So it made a difference in just their own laws on how they defined espionage versus treason. And so that's all that and 14 years was the maximum for espionage. And he got out in 9 for good behavior. Whereas our definitions are different, and there was a lot of other politics involved. As you said, McCarthy had started. He did his West Virginia speech. Fuchs was arrested. He confessed, and then he had a week that they didn't do anything with him. They just got information from him. And they arrested him on February 2nd. And I think McCarthy was mid-February. He went to West Virginia. So it was just weeks. So all of a sudden, there was all this information that came out at that moment. Just as McCarthy had these lists of names and things, it was exactly when Klaus was arrested. So it was just a tremendous whirlwind of communism, and it had been HUAC had been, the year before that with Alger Hiss, I think it was in 48, 49, and, just a few years before. And that had been going on for quite some time. So it really, in the US, there was much more in the news than in Britain. Britain kind of wrote about it and said, oh, well, now let's go on to the next story. They didn't make a big deal of it. Well, they also have a different legal system. They can't make a big deal of it because if too much information comes out, it jeopardizes the trial. You have to be, in fact, when the Brits gave the FBI information, it always seemed to leak out, and it would end up in the US news, and then it would end up in England. And the MI5 said, if it comes in here, it can mess up our trial. We're going to lose. We're going to have to not even have a trial if we are jeopardized by what's put in the British press. So that was a big concern to MI5 and the British. So it's harder for them to whip things up, or it was at that time with those particular laws, because they couldn't put a lot in the news.
Right. So the other surprising thing about the Klaus story, Klaus Fuchs, is he goes to prison. He spends 9 years in prison, and then I guess he's paroled and exchanged for, he's allowed to go to the Eastern Bloc, and he spends the rest of his life in East Germany. Mm-hmm. And a member of the Communist Party, a member of the elite. He's given, as such, privileges as a party member, and goes back to working on science. He tries to start a breeder reactor program. He believes in as a physicist, he believes in the idea that nuclear energy can, provide electricity, and that it's a force for good. And of course, these Germans have no interest in doing this. They've got all this black coal that they think they can rely on. So,
Yep.
So he has a rather frustrating career after this, but he's still loyal to the ideology, to the party.
He was loyal to the ideology, but he wasn't loyal so much to the party. He was a person who never complained. He just kept his mouth shut. But he did decide, he thought that Stalinism was terrible and a real bastardization of communism, not real communism. And I'm pretty sure he got to the same point with the East Germans. He didn't quite say it, but there were, he was devastated when they wouldn't let him do the breeder reactor program.
Right. That was a big disappointment.
A huge disappointment.
He got to know his son as a source, right?
His nephew. Yes, I do know him very.
He became a very important source for the book, no?
Very important, and he had all the family papers. One day, after I'd been visiting him for years, I'd visit him several times a year and sat, and we'd have lunch and chit chat.
And this is in Germany.
In Berlin, yeah. He had this whole closet full of information that I had no idea of. And at the very last minute, when he was about to ship it to an archive to have them work on it and, catalog it, which means I wouldn't have gotten my hands on it forever.
Yeah.
It turns up, and I said, I just sat there and took pictures with my iPad for days until I was just barely moving. That's where I found so much of the information. That and in the Stasi archives is where I had the information for what happened to him in his later years, and also the stories from the family, because whereas the earlier times no one was around then, in these times he had a niece who had been American niece who went to university in Leipzig, and she gave me a lot of information too, because she used to go visit him on weekends. So I had real firsthand knowledge of what he was like during that time.
No, it's ironic. You get these surveillance transcripts from the British intelligence, and then you get the Stasi archives to tell you what he was doing in his life after he gets out of prison. Yes. Remarkable.
Let me say, everybody in East Germany, for the most part, was an informant. If they worked for you in your house, they were informing on you. That's why they were there. So there was lots of information from lots of different people.
So coming back to his father, Emil, who obviously was really important in his whole life. And you quote Klaus saying of his father, Emil, quote, "He was never a man of the church, but of faith." And then you write, the same could be said of the son. So tell us a little more about Emil, the father.
He had oh no, we're coming back to a problem. Let me move closer. That seems to do it. He had his own way. He had his own ideas about religion. He was very faithful to the Bible and those principles, but it wasn't his ethics and his personal attitude toward the social side of him, the sense of equality, weren't part of the Lutheran Church in Germany anyway. And he just made his own way in that church with his own principles and his own ethics. So he took what he saw as the faith, and that's what he preached, but it wasn't what the Lutheran Church preached. It wasn't their dogma. He expanded it, and that was Emil. And he was also very involved in education. He helped reform adult education in Germany. He was always out doing something. He never stayed still. He was always advocating for something, and he was writing pieces in the newspaper, and he was railing against the right-wing militia that was going on. And when he made it through the war, he was in prison for a while because he always was talking too much, and his children got nervous about what he might say about them too. And so they didn't tell him much so that he couldn't repeat it, because he always seemed to. And just not to be mean, he just ran his mouth. And he said something about the Nazis to a person who had been part of a parish he'd been involved with, and she went and told the police, and they put him in prison for 6 weeks. And he was found guilty, and he was lucky. It was in 1933 when there were still decent judges, and so they gave time served was what he did. It was those 6 weeks. But that's who he was. He was just always pushing, and yet he never gave up. He was one of the most determined people. He lived to 97, and I think even at that age, he was still out there, writing letters and pushing people. That was Emil.
Yeah.
But he did it inside.
Very strong influence on his son.
Yeah, and the other people in the family too.
So, coming to sort of the end of the story, the point of it all, there's always in every spy story an argument about, well, did the spying make any difference? Did it change history? And you make an argument at the end of the book. It's only speculation, but you point out in terms of the chronology of events that Fuchs, his spying may have helped the Soviets advance their own atomic bomb program by a year or two. Mm-hmm. And if so, they got the bomb in 1949, and so it was available as such on the shelf there when the Korean War breaks out. And if they had not developed the bomb in 49 and had been delayed until 51 or 52, well, there's a possibility the Korean War would have started, and there would have been a temptation by the Americans to use an atomic bomb again against the Chinese troops that were intervening and pushing back the Americans. So in that sense, what Klaus Fuchs did may actually have changed history and have prevented the use of another atomic weapon.
Yes, that is true. I mean, then you can also argue, did the means justify the end? There's that question. And there were a number of factors of why we did not drop a bomb. We had bombs sitting on some island ready to go with the planes there, and MacArthur wanted to do that, and Truman said no. But there were a number of factors. So you can't say it was just the fact that they were afraid of the Russians, but that had to be a piece of it. Along with the other factors. So from a military point of view, it had that consequence. From a political point of view in the US, it certainly helped fire up McCarthy in particular, and newspapers that were that way. So that had a profound effect on us, I think.
So you end the book with a question about Klaus. Was he good or evil? A traitor or a hero? And that you even ask the question is kind of shocking. I mean, we think of him as a spy, and yet you can ask, was he a traitor or a hero? And I guess it's an open question at the end of the book, huh?
Right. I mean, in terms of, someone asked me if he was evil, which is why it kind of made me think about the moral ambiguity and accountability of people. And they have we all have none of us are perfect. And we all have things we do that aren't consistent with our personality, as some people would see it. And although he was fairly consistent, you can read his principles, kind of the way he carried them through, is the way he saw it. But if in fact what he did helped us, convinced us in part not to drop a bomb, that's, to my mind, and probably to yours, that's a good thing. If he had, and so
it's a little ambiguous, but
it is ambiguous. Yes, and so many of us have, I mean, the people we're talking about now in what we're doing with our own history, this person did this, but they also did something that was decent. So this is not an unusual kind of question. We're talking about Thomas Jefferson and people like that, where there are many facets to people's personalities, and how do you grapple with them? Is it all or nothing? Are they either just all good or all bad by one dimension? Or can you somehow look at these things in a fuller way? And maybe you can't come to the answer, but you can appreciate the fact that there are different perspectives in a person, in all of us. So that's
absolutely. Well, I want to move to some questions we've got in the Q&A box here. But before I do so, just following up on that, I was sort of astonished at the end. You have a funeral scene when Klaus dies.
Yes.
And who is in attendance but Vladimir Putin is there?
Yes.
Incredible.
He was the Russian, and there's a picture of him, and it was a newspaper picture, so it wouldn't have gone well in the book. But he was the Russian representative because he was the KGB agent in Dresden, and that's where Fuchs was living. So they brought him in. I mean, who's just this, young guy?
He probably thought he was a hero, right?
Right, he probably did, but he is the Russian government has never acknowledged that he spied. That, for the most part, Fuchs spied for them. Never.
So let's move to some questions from the audience. Here's one. Was Fuchs outraged by the use of Nazi scientists like Werner von Braun by the U.S.? I guess he would have heard about this in prison.
Assuming he heard about it in prison. He never made any mention of it. So I honestly don't know the answer to that one way or the other. And I don't know if he ever knew about it. I don't think they had a lot of newspapers to read and things like that in prison.
Right.
So, may not.
So here's another question. Did he express regret about his spying, aside from the risk that it ran for his friends at the time? Did he later issue an apology? Did he ever?
Never. He never said, I shouldn't have spied, except in connection with his friends. He did not feel that he had done anything wrong by giving the information to the Russians. End of story.
Yeah.
Except the effect on his friends.
Well, he's like his father, very determined and loyal to his beliefs and principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So another question here. Could you say a few words about Klaus's relationship with his one-time handler, Ursula Kuczynski, alias Sonia?
Sonia. Yes, that was he started working with her in about 1942, and so it would have been 1942, 43 before he went to the U.S. She was part of this interesting family of German communists, all of whom came over to London. And her brother was a very close, I don't know if they were friends, but they were compatriots, Jürgen. And he actually was here in the US for a while. It was Jürgen who put his sister in touch with Klaus in order to be his handler. And Klaus, it appears that Klaus had never, whereas he knew Jurgen and he may have known some of the others, he didn't seem to know Ursula. So Ursula, he didn't identify as a member of the Kaczynski family. And they had a very professional relationship. She is one of the top spies for the communists, and she's worked in a few different countries. She and he would meet in Banbury and walk along the lane and pretend they were boyfriend and girlfriend, and he would hand her whatever information he had at that time, and she had a special place to put it behind a tree, and someone else would come and fetch it. You know, they had the whole thing worked out, and they did that for a year and a half. It was about that amount of time, I think. So they didn't have a long relationship, but it was very professional, and she was one of the best. There's no doubt. When he was, and he supposedly, he never got back in touch with her. But it turns out that when he was at Harwell, which is near Oxford, she was in a little town, maybe 20, 30 miles away. And I wondered if perhaps they had gotten in touch just themselves. And she was perhaps the person who told him that the Arlington people, in working on the messages, that there was a possibility that they could come up and find out about him. Because they were just right there. The first night he was interviewed, he disappeared for hours. MI5 didn't know where he was. And he had a car. He could have driven to see her. No one was following him at that moment. So I don't know if they ever saw each other again or not. So I don't know the full relationship. And her family, I would have been interested in talking to her family, but her children around, but there's a certain narrative they have that they give, and their books written. That she wrote an autobiography, a memoir, and someone else who's a family friend, a journalist, wrote something else in German, and it doesn't say anything other than what we already know. So I wasn't able to get to the family, and I wouldn't have gotten any information. I don't think there was any new and different. So, but no, they had a professional relationship is the answer. And if they had more, which could be possible, nobody knows.
So mysteries remain.
Mysteries remain.
So if you could ask Klaus Fuchs one question, what would it be?
Well, my one question is, I have actually two questions I want to ask him. I would ask him how he knew that what was going on in Arlington, and that he was close to being uncovered. Mm-hmm. He never said anything about it. So that story is one. But there's another story. It turns out he was in a piece of British history that most people don't know much about, is their internment that they interned 30,000, mostly German refugees. 90% of them were Jewish. They decided that these Jews would be a fifth column and help the Germans invade. This is what they said in the cabinet meetings. They said, once a German, always a German. So they rounded them all up, 30,000 of them. And some of those, several thousand, they sent to Canada. And in Canada, Fuchs was free. He was very free about his communism, and he became under the influence of a charismatic person by the name of Hans Kahler. There were probably there was a small clique of communists in this camp, this internment camp in Canada. And one of those people, and these were many of the people in these were young university students, or very, very, as one of the camp commanders said, I have the smartest group of people any place in Canada right here. And one of them ended up being a Nobel Prize winner. They made all kinds of amazing scientific discoveries, these people, later on in their lives, because they'd been taken out of just like Fuchs. He was in Edinburgh. He was, working on, had a postdoc with Max Born. He was taken off. And that's what happened to all of them. One of those people was another physicist, and it turned out that who was part of this communist group, and it turned out when Klaus was head of theoretical physics at Harwell in England in the late 40s, this person worked for him. So he knew that Klaus was a communist, and because Klaus did not hide his feelings when he was in the camps. And he worked for him, and there was a lot of tension between them. I knew this person's wife, and I went and talked to her on a number of occasions, and she would tell me about it. And I would like to know if what the relationship was and how they bridged this problem of this person knowing about Klaus's communism, because Klaus did not say he was a communist at that point. At that point, he was only saying he'd been a social democrat, which was true. He didn't give the other part. The person knew he was. So how did they work this out? I have no idea. And I tried to find out, and nobody knew. I know that family. I know his family well, and they didn't know.
They didn't know, right?
They didn't know.
So another member of our audience tonight asks, can you outline the nature of the information that Klaus shared or knew, and how exclusive was it?
He first worked on diffusion, gaseous diffusion, which takes the isotope you want to use out of the uranium in order to be able to use it and have a chain reaction in their uranium bomb. So that was his first thing. And he a lot of the theory behind it. And when he came to the US, he worked out all the controls of the whole plant for the US. So if you had this problem or that problem, here's what you do. It was highly technical, getting one of these things to work. This was, what were they? The size, a diffusion plant was the size of 3 football fields or something. And there were thousands of filters that had to go through. So that was one piece, and they had all that information completely. When he went, that's all he had at first, because that's all he did. When he went to Los Alamos, he worked on the plutonium bomb. And he worked on the lenses that were explosive, and they had to compress at a certain time. It was one millionth of a second was the timing on these lenses to compress the core and create the chain reaction with plutonium. He gave those whole plans to the Russians on June 2nd of 1945. They may have been more theoretical but he had a lot of the drawings and things in there too. So they could use that. That was
really useful.
Yeah, that was
information.
There were other people there, Ted Hall being one of them, who supposedly also gave them that similar kind of information, but I don't think he would have been in a position to know as much as Klaus did, because Klaus was right in the thick of things. And Klaus had a lot more. I mean, they were both very, very smart. There's no doubt about it. But Klaus did have a lot more. When you're 18, even if you're smart, there's just still some things you don't know, no matter how smart you are.
Hall was only 18 or 19 then.
Yeah, he was very young at that point.
Yeah.
So
access to much more information.
Yeah, he did have much more, and he was creating some of it himself as well on these lenses. So,
okay. Well, listen, Nancy, this has been a delightful conversation. We're a little bit over the hour, so we'll, I think, end on that note. I want to thank you very much for being willing to do this, and I hope our audience will come back in a few weeks, well, in a week on August 13th for a biography of yet another scientist, JBS Haldane, written by Samantha Subramanian, and we'll have that conversation conducted by Carl Zimmer, the New York Times science reporter. So I'm sorry, Nancy.
I was just going to add, the person that Klaus was involved with in the camps, who ended up being, I mentioned him, Hans Kahler. He was a recruiter, an agent for the Russian military intelligence, and I'm pretty sure he did work for Haldane. He was every place. Hans Kahler. He was amazing. So I'm pretty sure it was Haldane that he did I may have gotten it. No, I'm almost sure it was Haldane.
Yeah. Well, Haldane was a member of the Communist Party himself.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I don't think it's spy.
No, I don't think he was a spy either. But if he were going to, Collar would have convinced him. Believe me. So anyway,
I just thought of another question. I'm curious to know:
Yeah.
have you landed on a new project? Are you doing another biography, or you're uncertain?
I'm looking.
Okay.
This whole our life at the moment kind of threw a few bricks in, and so you're just trying to figure out the landscape. It takes a while with all of this, so I'm just going to kind of get through this phase, and then I'm hoping something will fall in my lap, because that's what happened with the other two. Right. How do you think I should do? Let me know.
Well, I hope you find a new project that's
well. Thank you very much.
fun and productive as this one was. Anyway, thank you very much.
And I thank you for
Good night.
Good night. Thank
You
you.
all.